A man like that priced Garrett Ballard's inheritance at $3,800. 6 acres, 4 ponds nothing had lived in for 6 years. His father's last quiet bet, the one he never got the chance to finish. The buyer came while the grief was still fresh, friendly, patient, paperwork already filled out. That is how it is done to men like Garrett, not with a fight, with a number and a smile, and the quiet certainty that a broke single dad has no choice but to take what he is given. Garrett was 44, one wage short of the end of every month. The kind of man whose opinion nobody at the co-op had ever once asked. He read the number. Then he turned the deed over and read the single line his father had left him in pencil. And he did not sign. The friendliness went out of the buyer's face the way heat goes out of an evening, slowly, then all at once. He gathered his papers without another word about fairness, and from the window of his clean car he left Garrett something to keep. That's the only offer that swamp will ever see. Dead water doesn't come back. Ask anybody. By Sunday, the story had made every diner counter in town, and it improved with the telling. The maintenance man had turned down cash money for a graveyard. Men who had never once walked that land laughed into their coffee. Even the ones who liked him shook their heads. And somewhere in all that laughter, Garrett came to understand what his father must have carried quietly for 40 years. The loneliness of seeing worth where a whole county had agreed there was none. Garrett let them laugh. He drove 90 miles north and asked a hatchery for the fish they were about to kill. The off-grade ones, the rejects. The ones another office had already decided were worthless too. The county laughed harder. The company waited the way it had waited out every other small man in that county. 2 years later, the ones who laughed would be paying him for those fish, and the men who priced him would drive back down that gravel road, name a real number this time, and leave with nothing. Because none of them counted on the one thing that had no price. A single penciled line from a dead man. The one Garrett would not understand until the morning it came true. Before the story goes on, one small thing. If you believe a man's worth was never something an office could put a number on, type a 1 in the comments below. One for every man still being counted out, and one for a good day coming your way. It cost nothing. Neither did those fish. Now, back to that winter. Walt Ballard had died in the winter, quietly, the way he had done most things. He left his son 6 acres of played-out bottomland at the edge of the county, 4 ponds dug into it, 3 that still held water and a 4th gone dry as a skillet, and a rusted aerator that had not turned in years. He left a truck that ran and a shed of tools that all worked. And on the back of the deed, in pencil, in the blocky hand of a man who had never wasted a word in his life, he left a note. Walt had spent 40 years taking in ground other men had given up on. Worn-out fields, foreclosed back 40s, a few acres somebody had farmed down to hardpan and walked away from. He bought them cheap when he could and coaxed them back, and he rarely made much doing it. People called him stubborn. What they meant was that he could read a piece of tired ground the way other men read a page, could crouch and work a handful of dead soil between his fingers and tell you exactly what had been taken out of it and exactly what it still had left to give. He believed, plainly and without any sentiment about it, that almost nothing was ever truly finished. It was only waiting on someone patient enough to see it. The 4 ponds had been one of his last quiet bets, bought for near nothing from a catfish operation that had gone broke, meant to be brought back someday, and left to sit when someday ran out on him. The things a man throws away are not always broken. Sometimes they are only early, sitting in the dark, keeping their worth to themselves, until the right pair of hands comes looking. Garrett was 44 and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He ran maintenance at the co-op, a job he did well and did not love, and he raised his kid alone. The land was the last thing he needed. So when a local buyer knocked within the month and offered $3,800 cash for ground that grew nothing and drowned nothing, it should have been the easiest signature of his life. The man was friendly. He had the paperwork filled out already, as though he had settled on the number before he ever pulled into the drive. Garrett did not sign. He turned the deed over instead and read the note again. Nothing worth keeping is ever truly finished. It's only waiting on the right hands to notice it. Dad. He did not understand it. Not really. Not yet. Not the way he would come to understand it 2 years later, standing on a bank at dawn with the whole thing finally making sense. But he understood enough to set the pen back down and hand the paperwork back unsigned. He drove out to walk the ponds properly, and they were worse than memory had let them be. The banks were cracked and slumping, undercut where muskrats had tunneled and the water had followed them in. The aerator was a cage of rust, its paddle frozen in place, one blade snapped clean off. And the water itself smelled wrong. A low sulfur reek coming off the shallows, the smell of something that had been still for far too long. Nothing moved on the surface. Nothing rose to a bug. It was, by every measure a reasonable man could take, exactly what the neighbors said it was. Vernon Ordway came out because that was his job. 30 years with the Extension Office had made him a man who had watched more fish operations die than most people knew existed, and he did not laugh at Garrett, and he did not encourage him, which Garrett would only later understand were the same act of respect. He crouched at the waterline, rubbed a little of the bottom muck between his fingers, and gave it to him straight. Rehabbing 4 ponds would cost more than Garrett had. Most operations failed inside the first year. Hay was easier than fish, Vernon said, and paid slower and surer, and a sensible man would run a few cattle or lease it out and forget the water was ever here. Then, standing, wiping his hand down his jeans, he added one more thing, almost to himself. The dry pond, the 4th one, had better bottom soil than the other 3. Firmer, cleaner. It wouldn't matter now. But it might matter someday, if a man ever got that far. Garrett drove 90 miles north to a hatchery on the strength of a rumor. Marlene Kirby ran it, and she was sitting on a batch she could not sell. Several thousand channel catfish and hybrid bluegill that had come up off-grade and uneven. A restaurant contract collapsed out from under them. A mixed-species tank error nobody upstream wanted to put their name to. She could not ship them. She would have to pay, out of her own thin margin, to have perfectly healthy fish destroyed. Garrett asked if he could take them off her hands. For free. And then, before she could answer, he asked for more. Whatever else she had coming that she would otherwise have to kill. Marlene looked at him a long moment. Nobody asked for reject stock. Nobody, in her memory, had ever asked for more of it. She figured his ponds would fail exactly the way the extension man had surely told him they would. But a failing pond 90 miles south was still cheaper than the disposal invoice sitting on her desk. So she said yes, and wrote his number on the back of a feed receipt, and did not expect to use it again. For 2 days, the fish were only a silver shimmer under the surface, a thing he checked at dawn and at dusk, the way you check on anything you are afraid to lose. On the 3rd morning, they were on top of the water, belly up. Nearly 1,800 of them, catfish and bluegill together, ringing the shallow end of the near pond in a pale, motionless band. The sun was already beginning to warm. He had not known that a pond breathes. That through the night, with no light to run it, The green water stops making oxygen, while the fish and the algae and the mud go on spending it. That the most dangerous hour in a pond is the one just before dawn, when the tank is nearly empty and the light has not yet come to fill it again. He had put close to 5,000 mouths into water that could not carry them through the dark, and the dark had taken the weakest first. Vernon did not say that he had told him so. He came out, looked at the band of dead fish, and started talking about equipment in a flat, practical voice. A paddle wheel aerator to beat air down into the water, a generator to run it where there was no power, and a timer set to bring it on in the black pre-dawn hours and shut it off when the sun came up to take over the work. It would cost, Vernon said. It would cost very nearly everything a man in Garrett's position had left. Garrett bought it. He set the wheel at the near pond and wired the timer himself, his hands sure on the work the way his father's had always been sure. And that night he lay awake listening to the far-off slap of the paddle turning water he could not see. Before first light he walked down to the bank in the cold. The wheel was throwing a low silver arc up into the dark, and below it the water was alive, 1,000 small backs breaking the surface, feeding, breathing, still here. He had lost just over a third of them and saved the rest with the last of his money. And standing there, he did not feel like a fool. He stayed on the bank until the sun cleared the tree line. Then he went inside and called the hatchery and asked Marlene when the next truck could come. The storm came in early summer, after a week of heat that left the water flat. 4 inches fell in a single night. Garrett heard it before he understood it. A low tearing where the second pond's south bank had held for 6 years and now would not hold anymore. He was out there by 2 in the morning, in a headlamp and no coat. The patch he'd laid that spring, the one Vernon had called good enough, had gone soft and let a channel open. Water was leaving in a brown rope, carrying off fingerlings he could not afford to lose. He did not call anyone. There was no one to call. He filled sandbags from the pile by the shed and carried them down 2 at a time. And when the bags ran short, he packed the gaps with clay from the 4th pond's dry bed, working it in with bare hands until the cold left them. It took until first light. The breach held. He sat on the wet bank and thought about his father, coaxing life back into ground other men had written off, and how nobody had ever paid Walt a dime to be that patient. The Herons came a week later. He'd read that a fence would stop them. He built one and lost catfish anyway, because a heron does not walk to water. It flies. It drops out of a gray morning and stands in the shallows like it owns them. And a fence is only a thing it looks down at on the way in. So he quit fighting the wrong war. He strung netting across the open face of the water, low, pole to pole, the cheapest mesh the farm store sold. But a heron cannot land on water it cannot reach, and that ugly net did what the proud fence never had. If you have ever been handed something the whole world had already thrown away, and been called a fool for the crime of not throwing it away too, then you already understand why a man walks back down to those ponds before the sun is up, every morning, when no one is watching, and no one would clap if they were. These stories get told for people like that. If that's you, subscribe and stay. You'll know the ending is yours long before it arrives. Then the feed got expensive. A soybean meal shortage moved through the region that summer, and the price of protein pellets climbed by nearly a third almost overnight. Garrett stood in the co-op with a bag on his shoulder and ran the arithmetic he'd been dreading. He had thousands of fish that ate every day, and a kid at home who ate too, and none of them cared what the market was doing. The obvious answer was to feed less, and he was ready to. He mentioned it to Vernon, the way a man mentions a decision he's already made. And Vernon set down his coffee and told him no. "Starve them a little now. You don't save money," Vernon said. "You grow a pond full of weak, uneven fish. Protein short stock stunts. It gets nervous. It gets sick." He let it sit. "Feed's the cheapest part of this. Losing the whole year is the expensive part." So he drove past the big supplier to a smaller regional outfit 2 counties over and talked the man there into a bulk contract for the year. More upfront than he wanted, steadier than he'd hoped. It was the first deal he'd struck from a place that wasn't quite begging. And somewhere in those weeks, without deciding to, he learned to read the water. His father had read Tired Ground the way other men read a page, a handful of soil, a look at what still grew stubborn at the edges, and he knew. Garrett had watched him do it his whole childhood and never believed it could be learned. Now he caught himself at the bank at dawn, reading. Fish rising to gulp at the surface in the gray light meant the oxygen had run thin in the night. Fish crowding the inflow pipe meant something had gone wrong in the water behind them. He learned to feed richer early in the season and leaner as it turned, to sink a thermometer and feel how the pond stacked in layers, cold below and warm above. The water had been talking the whole time. He'd finally gotten quiet enough to hear it. What he could not read, not yet, was the man. He had assumed the stranger who'd offered $3,800 for 6 acres of dead ponds was some optimist with bad information. He was wrong. The man worked for Meridian Aqua Group, a large commercial operation, mass water, mass fish, that had been quietly buying up the county's small ponds for a year, one lowball offer at a time. Garrett could not yet imagine why an operation that size would want water everyone agreed was worthless. He had lost just over a third of the fish he'd started with. Thousands were still alive, still growing, still his. That, it would turn out, was exactly the problem. He knew, now that he was looking, what had become of the Deal place 2 roads over. Old Man Deal had taken an offer like his the winter before. A little money for ponds he was too tired to fight anymore. And by midsummer the water was gone, drained and graded flat, folded into a Meridian holding pond so wide it took a truck 5 slow minutes to drive the bank. Nobody had laughed at Deal. Nobody had noticed him at all. That was the part that turned in Garrett's chest. Meridian did not beat a small man in a fight. It waited until he was tired enough to sell, and priced the tiredness in. The first fish he sold to a man who had laughed at him. It was a neighbor down the road, one of the ones who'd slowed his truck that first day to watch a fool stalk a graveyard. He came by late in the season, not quite apologizing, and asked whether Garrett's catfish were any good. Garrett opened the cooler on the tailgate and let him look. The man bought 4 channel catfish, counted the bills out slow, and drove off without much to say. It was the first money those ponds had ever made. He thought about that neighbor for a long time afterward, how a man could laugh at a thing on Tuesday and pay money for it by fall, and never once feel the distance between the two. It was not cruelty. It was only how most people looked at the world. Quickly and once and never again. Walt had been the other kind. Garrett was learning to be. Word moved the way it moves in a place like that. Slow, mouth to mouth, no faster than a man's word was worth. He carried a folding table to the farmer's market on Saturdays and sold what he could off ice. A diner 2 towns over started calling when it ran low. He filleted clean, kept the fish cold, never shorted anyone. He didn't advertise. He showed up the same every week, which in that county was its own kind of advertising. Then Hollis Grant drove out. Hollis ran a seafood restaurant 40 minutes away, a place with a reputation people drove for, and he had not come to a mud farm to do anyone a favor. He walked the bank, took in the water and the netting, and asked to see the fish before saying a word about buying. Garrett pulled a few. Hollis turned one over, checked the firmness, the color, the smell of a fish raised in water that had been paid attention to. "This is good fish," Hollis said. It wasn't flattery. The man didn't carry any. Better than good. Then he laid out his terms, because a restaurant runs on one thing above all others. "I don't want charity, and I'm not offering any. What I want is the same size and the same quality in every box, every delivery. Give me that and we've got something. Give me a great fish one week and a poor one the next and we've got nothing." He held Garrett's eye a beat. "Can you do that?" Garrett said that he could. He believed it. He was about to learn how much he still had left to learn. Consistency was the one thing his fish could not give him, and it took him a while to see why. He'd started with off-grade stock, the culls a hatchery couldn't sell because they wouldn't grade out even. In the water, the flaw had been invisible. Now it was the whole problem. Some fish had shot ahead, some had lagged. A single pond held a spread of sizes wide enough that no random netful matched the last. Hollis wanted every box the same. The pond handed Garrett every box different. So he learned to grade. He built sorting boxes with graduated bars, ran the fish through by size, and moved the slow growers into a section of their own, where the big ones couldn't crowd them off the feed. It was tedious, cold, endless work. But grading, he came to understand, was not a chore laid on top of the job. It was the job, the daily decision about what belonged where, what needed more time, what was ready. A man who wouldn't sort could not sell. He learned it the hard way. He failed Hollis's order twice. The first box ran uneven, and Hollis called him on it before the ice had melted. The second time, Garrett tried to slip a mixed run through, and Hollis caught it in a heartbeat. He nearly lost the account for good. He did not call to explain. He drove the 40 minutes, stood in the man's kitchen, and said it plain. No weather, no excuse, no story. He'd sent fish that weren't ready. He'd known it, and it would not happen again. Hollis looked at him a long moment, the way you look at a man to gauge whether he'll lie to you a third time, then gave him a standing weekly account. Plain honesty had bought back what a good fish alone never could. That night, sorting the last run by lamplight, Garrett finally understood the offer. $3,800 for 6 acres and 4 ponds and a bank that leaked. He'd carried the number all year as a stranger's honest mistake. It was no mistake. Meridian did not make mistakes about numbers. They had measured his water, priced his dirt, and set a figure exactly high enough to move a grieving man and exactly low enough to cost them nothing. And they had done it to every small pond in the county, one at a time, folding each into something larger. It was a bid. He set the net down on the cold ground. To men like that, a small place and the small people who worked it had never been anything but cheap stock. Culls to be graded out of the way, bought up quiet and absorbed, priced from an office by men who had never once stood on a bank at dawn and learned to read the water. His father's note came back to him then, the line he still could not fully unlock. Nothing worth keeping is ever truly finished. Meridian had looked at these ponds and seen something finished, something safe to swallow. Garrett stood in the dark a long while, and for the first time since the winter his father died, he was not tired. He was angry. The distributor's offer came on a single sheet of paper, and the volume printed on it frightened him more than anything Meridian had ever said. It asked for more fish than 3 ponds could hold. A man with sense would have read the number back slowly and let it go. Garrett read it twice, set it on the truck seat, and drove the 90 miles north to think. He took the loan he had spent his whole life avoiding. Walt had died owing no one, and Garrett had meant to keep it that way. But the fourth pond, the dry one, the one Vernon Ordway had towed at that first spring and called better bottom than the other three put together, was still sitting there like a held breath. He rehabbed it, cleared the silt, rebuilt the bank, watched the water come back the way patience comes back to a man who thought he had lost it. Then he hired Reggie Alton. Reggie had graded fish for Meridian for 11 years before they let him go in a quarter that needed a cleaner ledger. He knew size sorting the way Garrett was still learning it, and he could read a disease in a pond before it had a name. One more thing the big operation had thrown out for being off-grade. Garrett did not say that out loud. He handed him a set of keys. Reggie turned out to be worth 3 of the men Meridian had kept. He could stand at a bank and name what ailed a pond the way some men name the make of a passing car, and he taught Garrett to see it too. The roll of a fish going sick, the color of water about to turn. A company had graded him out for the sake of a cleaner quarter. Garrett kept finding the same lesson everywhere he looked, written in a dozen different hands. The thing set aside as worthless was almost never the thing without worth. The road taught its own lessons. Heat stress in the tank on a July afternoon, fish going soft-mouthed and slow. The ice-to-fish ratio he came to respect the way you respect a current. Too little and you lost the load. Too much and you froze what you were trying to keep alive. He learned it the only way anyone learns it, by losing a run and never doing it again. Winter brought the outbreak. Columnaris moved into the second pond quiet as fog, and it was Garrett's oldest habit that caught it. Walking the banks at first light, watching for the one fish holding wrong, fins clamped, hanging where it had no cause to hang. He and Reggie were on it before noon. They pulled the sick, cut the feed, held the loss to a corner of one pond instead of a whole season. And while he was on his knees at the water line, Meridian moved. They leaned on Marlene's hatchery, a big client leaning hard, to stop selling him the off-grade stock. They flooded the county market and dropped their price below what a small man could match. Preston Vance did the arithmetic in an office and decided the ponds would fold by spring. He had the numbers right and the reason wrong. He did not yet understand why these ponds had already survived everything sent to kill them. Meridian squeezed on 3 fronts, and on all 3, it closed on nothing. The hatchery went first. Vance's people told Marlene Kirby to cut Garrett off, and Marlene sat with the request about as long as it took to pour a coffee. The off-grade stock was mixed species, uneven, the kind of load that cost her a disposal fee and earned her $1 of nothing. Garrett was the only man in 3 counties who knew what to do with it. Cutting him off cost her a paying customer and handed Meridian a pond of fish they would only have thrown out themselves. She told them no. It was not loyalty as a favor. It was loyalty as plain sense, which is the only kind that holds. The market went second. Meridian's fish came in cheaper, and for 2 weeks it stung. Then Hollis Grant drove the 40 minutes himself, not to renegotiate, but to say the thing plainly. Same size, same freshness, every delivery, and Garrett had never once missed. The distributor found the same truth on its own ledger. Mass-produced fish arrived a day older and a grade looser. Consistency, it turned out, was not something you could flood a market with. The third front arrived in a clean car. Preston Vance came in person, laid an acquisition offer on the tailgate, and talked about scale, about efficiency, about how a sensible man knew when he had been beaten. He talked the way men talk when they have never once had to be quiet. Garrett let him finish. Then he wiped his hands on a rag and asked the only question that mattered. You want to own the water, he said, or you want to know what's in it? Vance had no answer, because the question was not really a question. It was the whole of it. Meridian had bought 100 ponds and learned to read none of them. Garrett had 4, and he knew every fish that held wrong at dawn. The people he had treated like people, Marlene, Hollis, Reggie, turned out to be the hidden value all along, paying back a decency no ledger kept a column for. Garrett had not raised his voice once. He had not needed to. A man who knows exactly what he is holding never has to shout about it. And everything he owned, the ponds and the fish, and the loyalty of 3 people the world had once thrown away, had been earned one cold dawn at a time. It could not be bought back out from under him, at any price Meridian was willing to name. Vance folded the offer and put it in his coat. The clean car went back down the gravel road, and it did not come again. The dead ponds were not dead. They never had been. They had only been waiting on someone patient enough to see it, and Scale, for all its money, had never once learned how to wait. The second year, he stopped selling only fish and started selling what he could do with them. A plain processing table. A small cold storage unit that hummed in the shed where Walt's tools still hung on their nails. Then a simple smoking setup, nothing a magazine would photograph, and smoked channel catfish going out to specialty grocers who paid nearly double for it. Marlene became a steady supplier. Off-grade, no longer a word anyone said with an apology. The 6 figures came near the end of that second year. Not in one dramatic sale. Not a check that made anyone gasp. Just the quiet accumulation of accounts, showing up all at once the evening he finally sat down and added the year against itself. He read the number twice, the way he had read the distributor's sheet a year before, and this time felt none of the fear. He found the note again on a morning like the first one. Walt's hand on the back of the deed. Nothing worth keeping is ever truly finished. It's only waiting on the right hands to notice it. Dad. He had read it 100 times as a line about the land, about 6 dead acres and 4 ponds, and the stubborn belief that mud could be made to pay. Standing there at dawn, the water going pink and loud with fish, he understood he had read it wrong every time. Walt had not been talking about the land. He had been talking about Garrett. The right hands. The son who fixed machines at a co-op he did not love, who had been graded off and set aside and told what he was worth by men who never looked closely. Walt had left him the ponds, so he would find that out for himself. Down on the gravel road, a truck backed toward the water, the way one had 2 years before. The same road, the same slosh of a load going in. Only now, nobody along the fence line laughed. Garrett walked the banks in the early light, reading the fish that held wrong from the fish that held right, the way Walt had once read a piece of worn-out ground the way other men read a page. The things worth keeping rarely announce themselves. They arrive graded off and set aside, called worthless by people in too much of a hurry to look. A dead pond, a rejected fish, a man the world had already counted out. What they wait for is never luck. It is a pair of hands patient enough to notice. If you have ever been the thing somebody set aside, look again at what sits quiet on your own land. Then pass this on to the one person you know who is still out walking their banks, waiting on the right hands to notice.